June 20th, 1947. Beverly Hills, California. 9:15 in the evening. A Spanish colonial mansion sits on North Linden Drive, quiet in the warm California night. Inside, the curtains are drawn. A radio plays softly. In the living room, a man sits on a chintz sofa reading the Los Angeles Times, illuminated by a lamp on the table beside him. His name is Benjamin Siegel, though most of the world knows him by a different name, one he despised being called to his face: Bugsy. He is 41 years old. He is wearing an expensive silk robe. His dark hair is perfectly styled, even at this late hour. He is handsome in the way that Hollywood defined handsome in that era. Sharp features, piercing blue eyes, the kind of face that photographs well and commands attention in any room. He does not know that outside, in the darkness beyond those windows, someone is watching him. 9 shots. The first bullet enters through the window and strikes him in the head. Then another, and another. By the time the 9th shot is fired, Benjamin Siegel is no longer sitting. He is no longer reading. One of his eyes has been blown across the room. Blood pools on the chintz fabric. The shooter, or shooters, accounts vary, walks away into the California night. No sirens follow immediately. The neighbors heard what sounded like fireworks or a car backfiring. It takes several minutes before anyone understands what has happened. Inside the house, a woman screams. Not his wife. His wife is in Las Vegas. This is someone else. There are always someone else with Bugsy Siegel. By the time police arrive, the body is already cooling. The newspapers will have the story by morning. Bugsy Siegel slain in Beverly Hills home. The coverage will be sensational, speculative, and mostly wrong about the reasons. But in New York, in a windowless room where powerful men conduct their private business, there is no surprise, only a quiet acknowledgement that what needed to happen has happened. The decision had been made weeks ago, perhaps months. The execution was merely logistics. Who was Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, and why did the most powerful criminal organization in America decide he needed to die? The simple answer is money. $6 million of Mafia money, invested, borrowed, and allegedly stolen, disappeared into a desert project that seemed destined to fail. A hotel and casino in the middle of Nevada that was bleeding investors dry with cost overruns, delays, and increasingly suspicious accounting. But the real answer is more complex. It involves ego, vision, and the fundamental miscalculation that a man can gamble with someone else's fortune and maintain their trust when the bet goes wrong. Bugsy Siegel was not a small-time criminal. He was not an impulsive gangster who got in over his head. He was one of the architects of modern organized crime in America. He had survived decades in a business where most men died young or spent their lives in prison. He had killed, extorted, and built criminal enterprises that generated millions. He was charming enough to seduce Hollywood actresses, violent enough to commit murder without hesitation, ambitious enough to envision transforming a desert town into an entertainment empire, and arrogant enough to believe the rules that applied to everyone else did not apply to him. That arrogance killed him. This is the story of how Benjamin Siegel rose from the poverty of immigrant Brooklyn to become one of the most feared and influential criminals in America, how he partnered with the greatest criminal minds of his generation, how he built something that would change gambling, entertainment, and American culture forever, and how his vision, his ego, and his inability to deliver what he promised cost him everything. Because Bugsy Siegel didn't just build Las Vegas, he bet his life on it. And he lost. Benjamin Siegel was born on February 28, 1906, in the Williamsburg section of Brooklyn. His parents were Jewish immigrants from Austria who had come to America seeking opportunity and found instead the grinding poverty of New York's tenement districts. Williamsburg in the early 20th century was not opportunity, it was survival. Families lived in cramped apartments without heat or running water. Children worked instead of attending school. The streets were controlled by gangs who extracted tribute from businesses and settled disputes through violence. Young Benjamin understood early that legitimate paths out of poverty were largely fictional. The real power, the real money, existed in the criminal economy that operated parallel to legitimate society. By his teenage years, Siegel was running a protection racket with a childhood friend named Moe Sedway. The operation was simple. They would approach pushcart vendors and offer protection from other gangs. If the vendor refused, Siegel would return and destroy the cart. Most vendors paid. But what distinguished Siegel from other young criminals was not his willingness to use violence. Brooklyn was full of violent young men. It was his capacity for extreme, disproportionate violence when challenged. There are accounts, difficult to verify but consistent across multiple sources, of Siegel setting fire to a competitor's pushcart while the owner watched, of Siegel beating men unconscious for minor disrespect, of Siegel demonstrating through action that crossing him, even in small matters, carried consequences far exceeding the original offense. This earned him his nickname, Bugsy, as in bugs, as in crazy, unpredictable, dangerous in the way that unstable men are dangerous, where you cannot calculate their response because rage rather than strategy governs their actions. He hated the nickname, would physically attack people who used it in his presence. But it stuck because it captured something essential about him, the thin membrane between charm and violence, between calculation and explosion. In his early 20s, Siegel formed a partnership that would define the rest of his life. He met Meyer Lansky. Lansky was everything Siegel was not. Short where Siegel was tall, intellectual where Siegel was physical, patient where Siegel was impulsive. But both men recognized in each other something valuable. Siegel had charisma and fearlessness. Lansky had strategic brilliance and organizational discipline. Together, they formed one of the most effective criminal partnerships in American history. During Prohibition, Siegel and Lansky built a bootlegging operation that generated enormous profits. They imported alcohol from Canada and Europe, distributed it across New York and New Jersey, and used violence to eliminate competition. Their organization worked with Italian crime families, Irish gangs, and Jewish criminals, building the alliances that would eventually form the National Crime Syndicate. But bootlegging was only part of Siegel's criminal portfolio. His true specialty was murder. In the 1930s, Siegel became one of the key figures in what law enforcement would later call Murder Incorporated, a professional killing operation that operated out of Brooklyn and took contracts from crime families across the country. Murder Inc. was revolutionary because it separated the act of murder from the motive. If a boss in Chicago needed someone eliminated, he did not use his own men. That created exposure, potential witnesses, connections that prosecutors could trace. Instead, he contacted Murder Inc., which would send killers who had no personal connection to the victim and no obvious motive that investigators could uncover. Siegel personally committed numerous murders for this organization. The exact number is unknown. Estimates range from a handful to over 30. What is documented is his enthusiasm for the work and his complete absence of remorse. A former associate once described watching Siegel commit a murder and then immediately go to dinner, where he ate with appetite and laughed at jokes as if nothing had occurred. This was not cold calculation.
Siegel was not coldly calculating. This was compartmentalization, the ability to separate action from consequence in a way that allowed him to function without the psychological burden that would cripple most people. This made him extraordinarily effective and extraordinarily dangerous. By the late 1930s, Benjamin Siegel was a major figure in organized crime. He had survived decades in a business that killed most of its participants. He had wealth, power, and the respect of the most important criminals in America. And he was bored. In 1937, the Syndicate sent Siegel to California with a specific mission: develop criminal operations on the West Coast, establish connections with the racing wire services that transmitted horse racing results, and generally extend the organization's reach into a region that had been relatively underdeveloped in terms of organized crime infrastructure. Siegel arrived in Los Angeles and immediately fell in love with the city, or rather with the version of the city that his money and connections could access. He rented a mansion in Beverly Hills. He cultivated relationships with Hollywood stars, directors, and producers. He dressed impeccably, attended the best parties, and presented himself as a businessman with vaguely defined interests in entertainment and real estate. The Hollywood elite found him fascinating. He was handsome, charming, generous with money, and carried with him the dangerous glamour of someone rumored to have connections to organized crime. Actors and actresses who would never have tolerated such associations in their public lives found themselves drawn to Siegel in private settings. He dated Virginia Hill, a woman who was herself connected to organized crime, and moved easily between the criminal underworld and Hollywood society. Their relationship was volatile, passionate, and marked by the kind of dramatic scenes that both seemed to thrive on. But beneath the glamour, Siegel was still conducting business. He established bookmaking operations, developed connections with corrupt officials, and built the criminal infrastructure the Syndicate had sent him to create. And he began hearing about a small desert town in Nevada where gambling was legal, a place called Las Vegas. In the early 1940s, Las Vegas was barely a town. Few thousand residents, some small casinos that catered mostly to locals and construction workers from the nearby Hoover Dam project. The hotels were shabby, the entertainment was minimal. It was, by any reasonable assessment, an unlikely place to build anything significant. But Siegel saw something others missed. He saw that the western United States was growing, that California's population was exploding, and that Americans had developed an appetite for gambling and entertainment that legal venues in Nevada could satisfy. More importantly, he saw an opportunity to build something that would be his, not the Syndicate's, not Meyer Lansky's, his. In 1935, Siegel began plans for a hotel and casino that would be unlike anything Las Vegas had seen. It would be luxurious, glamorous, designed to attract wealthy patrons from Los Angeles and beyond. It would have top-tier entertainment, fine dining, and accommodations that rivaled the best hotels in America. He would call it the Flamingo, after Virginia Hill's nickname, a reference to her long legs. He presented the project to the Syndicate's leadership and secured their investment. Meyer Lansky supported the vision. Other investors contributed. The initial budget was estimated at $1 million. And Siegel began to build his dream in the desert. Then he made the biggest gamble of his life: the desert. The Flamingo Hotel and Casino was supposed to open in late 1946, a New Year's celebration, Hollywood stars flying in, national press coverage, the grand unveiling of Benjamin Siegel's vision for the future of Las Vegas. It did not happen that way. Construction delays plagued the project from the beginning. Materials that should have arrived in weeks took months. Workers who were hired disappeared or demanded additional payment. The desert itself seemed to resist development. Water systems failed, foundations cracked, electrical installations had to be redone multiple times. and the budget began to spiral. 1 million became 2 million, then 3, then 4. By the time the Flamingo finally approached completion, the cost had reached $6 million, 6 times the original estimate. The Syndicate's investors were not patient men. They had invested in Siegel's vision based on his promises of profitability, his assurance that Las Vegas would become a gold mine, and their trust in his ability to deliver. But what they saw was their money disappearing into the desert with no clear return. Siegel kept asking for more. He kept explaining delays. He kept insisting that once the hotel opened, the profits would be so enormous that current costs would seem insignificant. But the Syndicate's leadership began to ask a more pointed question. Where was the money actually going? $6 million was an extraordinary sum. Even accounting for construction costs, luxury finishes, and the various complications of building in a remote desert location, the numbers did not fully add up. Rumors began to circulate. Siegel was skimming. He was siphoning funds into Swiss bank accounts. He was stealing from his investors to finance his lifestyle or to create a nest egg for himself in Virginia Hill. The truth was probably more prosaic, but no less damaging. Siegel was almost certainly not stealing in the sense of deliberately embezzling money, but he was spending with the reckless disregard for budget that characterized everything he did. He insisted on the finest materials, even when adequate materials would have sufficed. He made design changes mid-construction that required expensive modifications. He hired and fired contractors, sometimes paying multiple teams for the same work. He was building not just a hotel, but a monument to his own vision, and monuments are expensive. His partners did not care about the distinction between theft and incompetence. They cared that their money was gone and that Siegel could not explain where it went in a way that satisfied their scrutiny. Meyer Lansky, Siegel's oldest friend and most important defender, tried to mediate. He flew to Las Vegas, reviewed the finances, and attempted to determine whether Siegel was being victimized by corrupt contractors or whether he himself was the problem. Lansky's conclusion was ambiguous but damning. Siegel might not be stealing, but he was certainly not managing the project competently. The costs were excessive, the timeline was unacceptable, and Siegel's explanations were increasingly defensive and unconvincing. In December 1946, with the hotel still incomplete but pressure mounting to show some return on investment, Siegel made a fateful decision. He would open the Flamingo anyway. December 26th, a grand opening celebration. Hollywood stars were invited. Entertainment was booked. The plan was to demonstrate that despite the delays and cost overruns, the Flamingo would be successful enough to justify continued investment. The opening was a disaster. The hotel was not ready. Many rooms were still under construction. The casino floor was functional but unfinished. The grounds were incomplete. And on the night of the opening, a rainstorm hit southern Nevada, making travel difficult and keeping many invited guests in Los Angeles. Those who did attend found a venue that was impressive in concept, but rough in execution. The entertainment was good. Jimmy Durante performed, but the atmosphere was off. The staff was undertrained. The systems were untested. Guests won too much at the gambling tables because the odds had been miscalculated. Within 2 weeks, the Flamingo had lost money, not made it. Siegel was forced to close the hotel and delay the actual grand opening until the spring. For the Syndicate's investors, this was the final confirmation of what they had suspected. Benjamin Siegel was not competent to manage their investment. He had spent $6 million and had nothing to show for it except a half-finished hotel in the desert that was losing money. Siegel knew he was in trouble. He could feel the support eroding around him. Phone calls were not returned. Meetings were postponed. The men who had backed him were no longer interested in his explanations. He reopened the Flamingo in March 1947. This time, the opening was more successful. The hotel began attracting guests. The casino began generating revenue. Slowly, the Flamingo started to look like it might actually become profitable. But it was too late. The decision had already been made. In early June 1947, the Syndicate's leadership held a meeting. The subject was Benjamin Siegel. The arguments were straightforward. Siegel had lost $6 million of their money. He had failed to deliver what he promised. He had become a liability, drawing attention, creating exposure, and demonstrating through his mismanagement that he could no longer be trusted with major operations. Meyer Lansky, Siegel's oldest friend and most important defender, tried to mediate. He flew to Las Vegas, reviewed the finances, and attempted to determine whether Siegel was being victimized by corrupt contractors or whether he himself was the problem. Lansky's conclusion was ambiguous but damning. Siegel might not be stealing, but he was certainly not managing the project competently. The costs were excessive, the timeline was unacceptable, and Siegel's explanations were increasingly defensive and unconvincing. In early June 1947, the Syndicate's leadership held a meeting. The subject was Benjamin Siegel. The arguments were straightforward. Siegel had lost $6 million of their money. He had failed to deliver what he promised. He had become a liability, drawing attention, creating exposure, and demonstrating through his mismanagement that he could no longer be trusted with major operations. Meyer Lansky, Siegel's oldest friend and most important defender, tried to mediate. He flew to Las Vegas, reviewed the finances, and attempted to determine whether Siegel was being victimized by corrupt contractors or whether he himself was the problem. Lansky's conclusion was ambiguous but damning. Siegel might not be stealing, but he was certainly not managing the project competently. The costs were excessive, the timeline was unacceptable, and Siegel's explanations were increasingly defensive and unconvincing. In early June 1947, the Syndicate's leadership held a meeting. The subject was Benjamin Siegel. The arguments were straightforward. Siegel had lost $6 million of their money. He had failed to deliver what he promised. He had become a liability, drawing attention, creating exposure, and demonstrating through his mismanagement that he could no longer be trusted with major operations. Meyer Lansky, Siegel's oldest friend and most important defender, tried to mediate. He flew to Las Vegas, reviewed the finances, and attempted to determine whether Siegel was being victimized by corrupt contractors or whether he himself was the problem. Lansky's conclusion was ambiguous but damning. Siegel might not be stealing, but he was certainly not managing the project competently. The costs were excessive, the timeline was unacceptable, and Siegel's explanations were increasingly defensive and unconvincing. In early June 1947, the Syndicate's leadership held a meeting. The subject was Benjamin Siegel. The arguments were straightforward. Siegel had lost $6 million of their money. He had failed to deliver what he promised. He had become a liability, drawing attention, creating exposure, and demonstrating through his mismanagement that he could no longer be trusted with major operations. Meyer Lansky, Siegel's oldest friend and most important defender, tried to mediate. He flew to Las Vegas, reviewed the finances, and attempted to determine whether Siegel was being victimized by corrupt contractors or whether he himself was the problem. Lansky's conclusion was ambiguous but damning. Siegel might not be stealing, but he was certainly not managing the project competently. The costs were excessive, the timeline was unacceptable, and Siegel's explanations were increasingly defensive and unconvincing. In early June 1947, the Syndicate's leadership held a meeting. The subject was Benjamin Siegel. The arguments were straightforward. Siegel had lost $6 million of their money. He had failed to deliver what he promised. He had become a liability, drawing attention, creating exposure, and demonstrating through his mismanagement that he could no longer be trusted with major operations. Meyer Lansky, Siegel's oldest friend and most important.
Meyer Lansky, Siegel's oldest friend, argued for leniency. He pointed out that the Flamingo was now operational and beginning to show profit. He suggested that given time, Siegel could repay the investors and prove the vision had been sound. But others were less forgiving. They argued that trust, once broken, could not be repaired. That allowing Siegel to escape consequences for his failure would signal to other members that incompetence was tolerated. That the organization's credibility depended on enforcing accountability. A vote was taken. The result was not unanimous, but it was decisive. Benjamin Siegel would be killed. The contract was given to professional killers. The location was selected. The timing was determined. And on June 20th, 1947, as Siegel sat in a borrowed mansion reading the newspaper, the decision made weeks earlier in a windowless room in New York was executed in a burst of 9 gunshots. Within 20 minutes of Benjamin Siegel's death, Mafia associates walked into the Flamingo Hotel and took control. There was no period of uncertainty, no struggle over succession. The organization had planned for this contingency, and they executed the plan with the same efficiency that characterized everything else they did. The Flamingo, the project that had cost Siegel his life, continued operating. Under new management, with better financial controls and more realistic expectations, it began generating the profits that Siegel had promised but never delivered. Within a few years, other hotels and casinos opened in Las Vegas, copying the Flamingo's model. The desert town that Siegel had envisioned transforming into an entertainment empire did exactly that, but without him. The irony was absolute. Siegel's vision had been correct. Las Vegas would become one of the most profitable ventures in the history of American entertainment. The model he pioneered, luxury hotels, casino gambling, top-tier entertainment targeted at wealthy tourists, would generate billions of dollars. But Siegel did not live to see it. He died believing he had failed, that his grand ambition had destroyed him, that the $6 million and the years of effort had amounted to nothing. Who ordered the killing? The consensus among historians and former Mafia members is that the decision came from the Commission, the ruling body of organized crime, with the support, or at minimum the acquiescence, of Meyer Lansky. Lansky never publicly confirmed his role, but he also never denied it. When asked about Siegel in later years, Lansky would speak about him with what seemed like genuine affection and regret. But he would also acknowledge that in the world they inhabited, certain outcomes were inevitable when certain lines were crossed. The shooter was never definitively identified. Various names have been suggested over the decades: professional killers, associates with grudges, men who were paid and then disappeared into the anonymity that the organization provided for such work. But no one was ever arrested, tried, or convicted. Virginia Hill, Siegel's girlfriend, was not in the house when he was killed. She had gone to Europe weeks earlier, ostensibly on vacation. Whether she knew what was coming or simply had good timing is a question that remains unanswered. Benjamin Siegel was buried at Hollywood Forever Cemetery in Los Angeles. His funeral was sparsely attended. Few of his Hollywood acquaintances showed up, either because they had not genuinely cared about him or because associating publicly with a murdered gangster was unwise for their careers. His wife, from whom he had been long separated, did not attend. Virginia Hill sent flowers but did not return from Europe. The men who ordered his death sent representatives but did not come themselves.
It was, in the end, a lonely conclusion to a life that had been defined by visibility, charm, and the constant presence of others. What should we make of Benjamin Siegel's story? What lesson, if any, can be extracted from the arc of his life and death? The easy narrative is about hubris. A man with talent and ambition reached beyond his capabilities, spent money that was not his, failed to deliver what he promised, and paid the ultimate price. This is a satisfying story because it reinforces the belief in consequences, that even in a criminal world where normal rules do not apply, there are still lines that cannot be crossed. But the deeper truth is more complicated. Siegel was not simply incompetent. The Flamingo, despite its cost overruns and troubled opening, proved to be fundamentally sound. His vision was correct. His assessment of Las Vegas's potential was accurate. If he had been given another year, if the Syndicate had been more patient, if the Flamingo's eventual success had come sooner, he might have survived. What killed Siegel was not failure, but the appearance of failure in an organization that could not tolerate it. The Syndicate operated on a foundation of perceived invincibility and absolute accountability. A boss who lost millions of dollars for his investors, regardless of the reasons, could not be allowed to walk away unpunished. The example mattered more than the individual. And Siegel's personality made his situation worse. He was not diplomatic. He did not manage relationships carefully. He demanded rather than negotiated. He assumed that his past successes and his friendship with Meyer Lansky would protect him from consequences. This was his fundamental miscalculation. In the Mafia, protection was never absolute. Friendship was a factor, but not a shield. And past achievements did not create permanent immunity from present failures. The men who voted to kill him did so not because they hated him, though some did, but because the organization required it. He had violated the unspoken agreement that governed all Mafia partnerships. You can take risks with the organization's money only if you succeed. If you fail, you accept the consequences. There is a final irony worth noting. The Flamingo, which cost Siegel his life, is still operating. It has been renovated, rebuilt, and rebranded multiple times over the decades, but it remains on its original site on the Las Vegas Strip. Walk through it today, and you will see no monuments to Benjamin Siegel, no plaques commemorating his vision, no photographs celebrating him as the founder of modern Las Vegas. The organization that killed him wanted him erased, not celebrated. And they succeeded in that, as they succeeded in everything else, efficiently, completely, and without leaving traces that could be traced back to them. Benjamin Siegel gambled with the Mafia's fortune. He believed he could spend their money, fail to deliver immediate results, and still maintain their trust through the force of his personality and the correctness of his vision. He was wrong. In the Mafia, you can gamble with money. You can take risks. You can even fail if you fail in ways that the organization finds acceptable. But you cannot gamble with trust. Trust is the currency that makes everything else possible, and once it's spent, it cannot be recovered. Siegel spent it. And on a warm June evening in Beverly Hills, he paid the price that men in his world always pay when the organization decides they are no longer worth protecting. The desert bloomed. Las Vegas became everything Siegel said it would be. But Benjamin Siegel was not there to see it. He died on a chintz sofa, reading a newspaper, confident even in his final moments that his charm, his vision, and his history of success would save him. They did not.